Okay, picking up here where the last video left off, we now have our mix thoroughly mixed, and we're going to fill our bucket. Which, tip, you want to place it where it's going to be. Not in the middle of the driveway, but rather, let's say right there where there's easy access. We water these plants with hoses all the time. It'll get watered by the entire staff whenever they see a need for water. We're very lucky that way. You probably have to ask your neighbors or your niece or somebody to water for you when you're not home. But we have a staff here that makes it easier. But if you do the perlite trick, you won't have to worry about that as much. There is a disadvantage I see to that spot. Nothing's perfect. It's in the shade at this time of the morning, but it's going to get lots of sun, and the Mediterranean herbs don't mind that afternoon sun. Lots of plants I'd really try and make sure I favored the morning sun, but the Mediterranean plants are much more forgiving of the heat. They come from a place that's famously hot. Getting there. Actually, maybe I can pick this up and dump it down. Yeah, that makes it easier. By the way, I got this pot from Troy's Greenhouse in Burnsville. And to give you an idea of cost, the pot included the composted cow manure, the mushroom compost, and the Proline mix. I think the bill was $28. So if you find a garden center that is, selling to the lower end market, probably Burnsville is not a high end area. They're going to be competitive and give you really good prices. You could go to another garden center and drop probably 45 bucks on that same mix. So now we're going to put the plants in. And I brought one plant out to talk here about that I'm not going to put in. But I highly recommend, if you're growing mint, even if you don't do other container gardening, unless you have acres and acres, that you put your mint in containers. Mint's very invasive, hard to control. It's no world in the summertime to not have mint for your tea. It's just not a world I want to live in, but I also don't want it to take over my garden. So I recommend that mint goes in its own container. We're going to plant lemon thyme. I want an English thyme here also. This is probably English thyme here, I think. Yes, English thyme, lavender, rosemary, and marjoram. Actually, I'm also going to bring one of the summer savory plants out and put that in there, and an oregano. So it's going to be kind of jam full, but herbs don't mind being jammed in close. I broke one of my own rules for the sake of expediency in a video, which is always to soak your seedlings before you take them out of the pot. This is still nice and moist. I watered it last night. That's going to be fine. And I recommend putting the thymes on the edge because they will spill over. Always firm your plants in really well, of course. And then you're going to put the lemon thyme on the opposite side so you don't get confused. You might want to leave your labels in until you get to know your herbs better. Eventually I think you'll find that they lack for aesthetic pleasingness, but for the moment we'll do that. Lavender and rosemary are going to be the center ones because they can get really big. This is the ARP variety of rosemary, which is quite cold tolerant. This planter could live out through the winter and probably do great. In a really brutal winter, it might freeze too solid for too long. Plants don't get enough water and they might die, but that's unlikely in our climate. Other places you might not want to leave it outside. You could put this on its own little roller and roll it into a garage or an outbuilding, and that would take care of that problem. I'm also going to stick chives in. They're not Mediterranean, but can't have an herb planting without chives. And rather than have you watch me go back in the greenhouse and get the little oregano and winter savory plants, I'll show you where they're going to go. And leave it at that. Now, even though this gets tall, I don't want to crowd the rosemary and the lavender too much. I want them to have some airspace. So it's going to go to an edge, even though it would be wiser in some ways to put it more in the center because it can get pretty tall. It's not low growing like the thyme and the marjoram and the savory and oregano. And this planter is going to do well if you use your herbs. It could quickly become overcrowded, but this is a production planter. It's not a showpiece. So generally, you can cut a third of the growth from any herb, give it a few weeks, and then cut a third again, and you won't hurt the plant at all. And of course, you don't have to do that in thirds. You can just have a good sense of that as you get a rhythm and harvest as you need to cook with. If you're not doing that, these guys are all going to get too close together in one of our, many long rainy events in the summer. They're all going to get too wet, and they're going to just turn black and die. So keep them spaced, let them grow, let them get their roots deep so they're always producing lots of herbs, but harvest those herbs and use them. And all that's left to do for this planter is stick those two plants, the savory and the oregano in, which I'll be doing right after the video, and then give it a good soaking. I mean a really good soaking. You want to water this thoroughly, come back and water it again a few times, because you're not going to get this wet with one watering. Probably 10 minutes of watering over the course of maybe half an hour. Let it soak in, come back, water it again, and then give it a good soaking every day. Unless it's raining, of course, then keep the water away from it, Really, an ideal situation would be to have this on a roller and have a carport. And those really rainy times, just slide it into the carport. The times that are so gray, there's not any photosynthesis happening anyways. If you can get these guys out of the rain, your herbs will be a lot happier. That's another reason why a container garden might work great. Finally, if you're going to be growing vegetables, you want to think about getting varieties that do well in pots. So John Henry Nelson has a wonderful heirloom called Czech Bush tomato. Highly productive. It actually seems to grow and produce as an indeterminate, but it never gets any bigger than a bush, about 5 feet tall, which you could stake easily in a pot. It'd do really well. And there are bush type squash and stuff. They'll even say in the catalog sometimes that they do well in containers. You want to pay a little attention, read a little up on stuff. You wouldn't want to grow something like the classic, incredibly good tasting Costata Romanesco zucchini, which gets probably 6 foot across in diameter and be way too big for a container. So read about your varieties and pick some that you think will do well in pots. And we'll be doing some experimenting between now and the class and be able to speak more to which varieties do well in containers. You also can grow things like ginger. We'll be looking at that in the class. Turmeric. We grow all our ginger and turmeric in containers. I grow citrus. We'll have the citrus down here, a plant called yuzu. I have a bay tree that's 6 feet tall. You can grow an amazing array of stuff in containers. And if you don't have sun any place but in your driveway, get that car in the street and grow that food. That's it for this installment of Resilience Daily. Remember to check out Living Web Farms on Instagram.